There's nothing interesting happening in the world. How am I supposed to sell newspapers in this day and age? I mean, just look at all our recent presidents. Grover Cleveland? Who the heck is that? Benjamin Harrison? Boring. Chester Arthur? I don't remember anything I learned about him in school. Man, I wish there was a war going on so I could sell more papers. Wait a minute. What if I start a war? William Randolph Hearst, pictured here being born from a demon, was a newspaper owner in New York City. He was extremely smart and creative, but what he didn't have was a soul. That's a dangerous combination. Hearst realized that by using crazy headlines, freaky images, exaggerated details, and sometimes straight-up fiction, he could sell more copies of the New York Journal. It was basically the 1800s version of clickbait. Like, come on, you'd totally click a thumbnail of a gorilla stealing our democracy, wouldn't you? Maybe I should try that sometime. Hearst was especially excited when a revolt against Spanish rule broke out in Cuba. That's fodder for tons of scary headlines. And Spain's choice to put down the rebellion was a brutal general named Valeriano Weyler, who forcibly relocated thousands of Cuban peasants into camps tightly controlled by the government, where the insurgents couldn't recruit them. Yay! More headlines! Stories about the Butcher of Cuba soon filled papers across America, even in papers Hearst didn't own. But Hearst didn't stop at reporting the news. He made the news. If nothing interesting was happening, Hearst would go create new news stories to report on. In one incident, the Journal had written a profile piece on a really sympathetic Cuban woman being held prisoner in Havana, the island's capital. Hearst wanted to follow it up with a story about her incredible escape from prison. The only problem was she hadn't escaped. So Hearst told one of his employees to go to Cuba, sneak into the prison, break her out, and write about it. It was an idea so ridiculous, so insane, that it worked, apparently? You can guess what happened next. More headlines. Support for a war to free Cuba spread like wildfire across the country. That can't all be attributed to William Randolph Hearst, since support was also growing in places where he didn't run the newspapers. But his flair for the dramatic certainly fanned the flames. There were also deeper, psychological reasons that Americans wanted a war. They had spent decades watching European empires gobble up warm Caribbean islands, relax on gorgeous Caribbean beaches, and profit from tasty Caribbean sugar. Americans were jealous and wondered why they didn't have overseas colonies to exploit too. Presidents daydreamed about getting some Caribbean islands for themselves, though the timing and politics never quite worked out. Besides, there was still plenty of land to steal from Native Americans, and America's leaders were a little preoccupied doing that. But by the 1890s, things were starting to change. America had taken over all the land from its east coast to the Pacific Ocean, and was boxed in by two large nations to its north and south. If the U.S. was to keep growing, it would have to grow overseas. There were also a growing number of Americans who just wanted a war. Any war. It had been several decades since the Civil War, and some Americans feared they had missed their chance for glory. One of these Americans was a young Assistant Secretary of the Navy named Theodore Roosevelt. Roosevelt was the definition of an energetic, tough guy who was constantly bursting at the seams hoping for adventure. And he had some problematic ideas about America's place in the world. He wanted America to become an awesome world power, with its hands in other people's affairs all over the globe. He thought that lots of people living in the mysterious lands of not America weren't ready to govern themselves, so big countries like America or Britain should just sort of control them for a while. Roosevelt was especially interested in having America grab up the Philippines, Spain's premier colony in East Asia. Not only would the Philippines give America's Pacific Fleet a great place to rest and refuel, but it would also give American businesses easy access to the beautiful, awesome, spice and rice-filled trade markets of China. So one day, when his boss at the Navy Department was out sick, Roosevelt went behind his boss's back and ordered Commodore George Dewey to amass American ships in Hong Kong. He wanted the Navy to be prepared to attack the Philippines as soon as war began. Roosevelt's boss could have fired him for taking such a brash action without permission, but instead his boss said, "Meh, that's fine," and chose not to reverse the order. Much to Roosevelt's annoyance, the U.S. president at the time was a fairly cautious man, William McKinley, and McKinley hoped to avoid war. See, McKinley had been born a long time ago. So long ago, in fact, that he had fought in the Civil War, one of the bloodiest and most horrific conflicts in American history. That meant McKinley remembered something many Americans at the time seemed to be forgetting, that war is actually a bad thing. Nevertheless, a series of unfortunate events in 1898 would make public opinion spiral out of control in favor of war and push McKinley down the mountain with it. Spain's ambassador to the United States wrote a really mean letter calling McKinley a weak man and tried to mail it to his buddies down in Cuba. But Cuban rebels intercepted the letter and gave it to, you guessed it, William Randolph Hearst, who had an absolute blast making sure everyone in America knew about the unforgivable insult to America's honor. Even more important, McKinley decided to send a Navy ship called the USS Maine to Havana Harbor to protect American interests. And what do you know? On February 15th, the Maine blew up. Over 200 Americans died in the blast. Decades later, evidence would emerge suggesting that the blast had been a tragic accident, but people didn't know that at the time. War hawks like Roosevelt and newspaper moguls like Hearst immediately claimed that those devilish Spaniards had blown up the ship, and millions of Americans across the country believed them. A growing chorus of politicians, newspapers, and regular citizens called on McKinley to go to war with Spain, and he finally gave in. In March, he asked Congress to spend $50 million on upgrades to America's military. In April, Congress passed a resolution declaring its support for Cuban independence, and saying McKinley could use military force if Spain refused to give up Cuba. McKinley ordered a blockade of key Cuban ports, and sent the formal demand for Cuban independence to Spain. Predictably, Spain said no, so just like that, it's war o'clock. Right from the start, this was a war that Spain didn't really have a chance to win. America had a hulky, industrialized economy, and a recently upgraded navy with ships covered in sturdy, awesome American steel. Spain's economy was sluggish, and its ships were old and outdated. The naval situation was like how different people react when they get notifications to update their iPhones. America had recently tapped Start Update Now, but Spain kept hitting Remind Me Later. These factors made it so easy to sink Spanish ships that a small child could probably do it from their backyard. And funnily enough, thanks to Roosevelt's devious planning, the first place where the two navies would be put to the test wasn't actually Cuba. It was the Philippines, 9,000 miles away. The most important island in the Philippines was Luzon, home to the capital city of Manila and to most of Spain's Pacific Fleet. So with war declared, that's right where the Americans in Hong Kong sailed. Commodore George Dewey led the U.S. force into Manila Bay. The Spanish Rear Admiral knew just how outmatched Spain's ships were and anticipated defeat, so he ordered his ships to stick to shallow waters near the coast, making it easier for sailors to get back to land when they inevitably had to jump off the ships. As expected, Dewey won an absolute blowout victory, sinking a huge chunk of Spain's Pacific ships in a single battle, reportedly with just one American killed. The U.S. would control Manila Bay for the rest of the war, and Dewey became a cultural icon. His name and face were slapped onto mugs, calendars, toys, and mountains. It's no wonder Dewey defeated Truman later on. It seemed like all the cool kids in school wanted to be like George Dewey. After the battle, German ships started lingering around the Philippines, figuring that if the Americans chose not to keep the Philippines after the war, maybe they could claim it for themselves. It's sort of like when someone doesn't have the key fob to enter your apartment building, so they awkwardly wait by the door for someone else to open it on their way out. Anyway, Americans didn't really feel like fighting a brutal land campaign in the Philippines with the small number of troops they had on hand, because that would have been hard. So instead, while waiting for reinforcements to arrive, Americans did the next best thing. They found some guy named Emilio who had been living in Hong Kong ever since leading a previous failed rebellion against Spain, brought him back to the Philippines, and let him loose to cause problems for the Spanish. In a matter of months, Filipino rebels had taken over a huge chunk of Luzon and put key cities under siege, including Manila. This was the perfect plan for the Americans, because picking up random rebel leaders and plopping them down in lands you might want to rule someday, hoping they only attack your enemies, is a plan that's guaranteed not to backfire. Back east, one of the first things the US Navy did was snip, snip, snip some of the underwater telegraph wires connecting Cuba to the outside world, so that Spanish troops there would have a hard time coordinating with ones outside of Cuba. This was the 1800s after all, and 5G cell service didn't exist yet. After that, it was time to invade Cuba. But the process turned out to be a logistical nightmare. Thousands of excited, poorly organized young men swarmed into Tampa, Florida to be part of the invasion force, but the military didn't have enough ships to fit them all in. Quarters were tight, especially when you consider that Americans also had to bring their weapons, horses, food, cannons, guns, clothes, and other equipment on the ships with them. Once the ships got to Cuba, things didn't get much easier. America's Cuban allies helped fight Spaniards on the coast to clear landing sites for Americans. But even then, the giant US warships often couldn't sail through the shallow waters right up to Cuba's coast. So instead, soldiers had to load all their food, guns, clothes, cannon, and other equipment onto tinier boats and sail those from the main ships to the shore. Some Americans who didn't feel like getting their horses to calmly stand in rowboats just started yeeting their horses into the sea and hoping the horses would be smart enough to swim to land. Some of them were. Soldiers also had to deal with Cuba's excessive summer heat, so a lot of Americans just ripped their clothes right off while unloading the ships. That's an image I wish I hadn't seen while researching for this video, so just be grateful I've censored the footage. The US picked the city of Santiago as its main objective in Cuba, since a huge chunk of Spain's Caribbean fleet was stationed there. The strategy was to blockade Santiago Bay so Spain's ships couldn't get out, then have troops surround the city by land so it would be trapped on all sides. The US established a base at nearby Guantanamo Bay. I bet you've never heard of that place before. And American and Cuban troops started fighting their way towards Santiago. At this point, McKinley thought, well, I guess I might as well blockade Puerto Rico too. So he blockaded Puerto Rico too. Now, you may be wondering what Theodore Roosevelt was doing back at the Navy Department this whole time. Well, you may be surprised to learn that he's not in the Navy Department anymore. He's actually in Cuba as part of the invasion force. See, having a desk job felt a little bit constraining for Theodore Roosevelt, a bit too claustrophobic, and it wasn't really giving off Roosevelt vibes. So shortly after war was declared, Roosevelt resigned from his cushy job at the Navy Department and joined up with the military. He helped form a brand new cavalry regiment called the Rough Riders, and soon found himself leading it. By the way, remember those reinforcements George Dewey was waiting for in the Pacific? Well, around this time, some of them were nearing the tiny Spanish island of Guam, with orders to conquer it on their way to the Philippines. Even though the war was 2 months in, It turns out that no one from Spain had bothered to tell the local Spanish commanders what was going on. This was the 1800s after all, and Guam was an isolated island in the middle of Micronesia. Presumably, the Queen of Spain tried to warn the governor of Guam about the war by calling him on her cell phone, but then remembered cell phones hadn't been invented yet, and decided, it's not that important. So when American ships got near, the Spaniards in Guam thought it was a friendly social visit and let them pull right up to the coast. Hi, Americans. Thanks for stopping by. It's been so long since we had visitors. Hi, Guam. Nice to meet you. Here's some info on our Prisoner of War program. Prisoner of War program? Why would I need this? Oh! With the Americans so close, it was a bit too late to change plans, so the Spaniards surrendered Guam without a fight. Slow communications were just one challenge of fighting in the Pacific. Another challenge was the great distances involved. See, the US is here, in North America, and the Philippines is here, on the opposite side of the world. That's a long way to travel without refueling your ships. And more importantly, where can dear old Uncle Sam take a day on the beach during this voyage? Wait a minute, I just remembered something. Isn't there another country in between the US and the Philippines? And wasn't there an incident a few years back where a bunch of Americans moved in, overthrew the government, and asked the US to annex them? Well, now is the perfect time to annex them. Kapow! Now America has a place to refuel its ships in the Pacific. That's how we got Hawaii. Before we finish up talking about the campaign in Cuba, there's something else you may find funny about this war. A few years earlier, a wild new piece of technology had been invented. The movie camera. Something the world had never seen before. That meant this was one of the first wars in history to be captured on film. Kind of. See, even though cameras now existed, these weren't the slick little handhelds that you and your friends use for home movies. These were clunky, blurry, expensive 1800s cameras, the kind you didn't necessarily want to carry around in a war zone. So, while there were a lot of real clips of troops embarking in Tampa or arriving on Cuban beaches, the battle scenes themselves were typically reenactments. Naval battles might be filmed using little toy ships at some guy's apartment in New York, and land engagements might be filmed in the woods next to Thomas Edison's house. Anyway, Americans and their Cuban allies had finally made their way to the outskirts of Santiago. The last big obstacle was a series of hills overlooking the city, collectively called the San Juan Heights. Spain had heavily fortified these hills. American forces, including the Rough Riders and several black cavalry regiments, made a really dramatic and cool-looking charge up Kettle Hill. Once they took it, Theodore Roosevelt was so incredibly giddy at the thought of more fighting that he shouted an order for his men to turn right around and help another U.S. force in taking San Juan Hill. Partway through the charge, he decided it might be worth checking to see if any troops had followed his order, and discovered that only about 4 people were following him. So he went back to the rest of his troops on Kettle Hill and asked them once again to follow him. It was one of the deadliest battles of the war, but the war-hungry Roosevelt loved every second of it. He later said San Juan Heights was the greatest day of his life. And just to be clear, he was already married with kids when he said this. No offense, Mrs. Roosevelt. Oh. With the San Juan Heights in American hands, Spain's fleet in Santiago Harbor was under threat. And besides, having their fleet sit around in the harbor while a war was going on hadn't actually been that helpful. So the fleet tried to leave the harbor, and immediately got blown up by the American blockade. As Spanish ships sank, the U.S. Navy pulled nearly 2,000 Spaniards from the water, and immediately arrested them as prisoners of war. The remaining Spaniards in Santiago surrendered a few days later. Having secured their biggest objective in Cuba, thousands of American troops got sent to invade their next objective, Puerto Rico. Thousands of other American troops got malaria instead. Spain's position in the war was dire. Most of its Pacific and Caribbean fleets had already been knocked out of the fighting. and rebellions were threatening several of its major colonies from the inside. Seeing this, Spain's government finally accepted that the war was hopeless and reached out to McKinley to start peace talks. The ceasefire was signed on August 12th, and negotiations over the final treaty began in Paris. Unfortunately for American forces in the Philippines, it was still the 1800s, and word of the ceasefire wouldn't reach them for several days. That meant they were about to fight one final, completely unnecessary battle. By now, Spanish forces in Manila didn't really feel like being under siege from the rebels anymore, but they were also extremely sensitive and didn't want to look weak by surrendering without a fight. In addition to being sensitive, they were also pretty racist and thought it would look better to surrender to a mostly white world power like the US than to a bunch of Asian rebels. Plus, they thought American soldiers would treat them better, given that, they had spent the last several hundred years oppressing Filipinos. With these factors in mind, the Spanish came up with a genius strategy. They would stage a fake battle for Manila with the Americans, pretend to be defeated, and surrender. They reached out behind the scenes to American commanders, saying, "Hey, if you fire at these forts at this day at this time, we'll pretend to retreat, and you can take over the city. But don't tell the Filipino rebels what you're up to, and under no circumstances let them enter the city with you." On August 13th, Spanish and American troops staged a glorious, devastating, horrible, mostly fake battle, like your old middle school plays. "Hello, I'm an American, and this is an assault on your position." "Oh no! I am going to shoot you now. Pow! Ow! That hurt. I surrender." Tragically, even though no one was supposed to die, a few soldiers who missed the memo thought it was a real fight and fired at each other. All told, over 50 people died in the performance. As the war drew to a close, politicians in Washington were still trying to figure out what exactly they were fighting for. I mean, sure, they were fighting for Cuban independence, but were they just fighting for Cuban independence? Were they also fighting to expand their territory? Were they fighting so that America could become a global power with colonies spanning the globe? Or would that be a betrayal of American values? President McKinley went on a speaking tour across the United States, and at each stop, he would ask the crowd whether the U.S. should annex the Philippines. Overwhelmingly, the crowd shouted back that it should. It seemed the American people were on board with becoming an empire. No Cubans, Puerto Ricans, Guamanians, or Filipinos were invited to be part of the treaty negotiations, because having a bunch of white guys sitting around a table in Europe deciding the fates of Asians, Pacific Islanders, and Latinos is exactly how to conduct a moral foreign policy program. When the Treaty of Paris was unveiled, it proposed that Spain would give Puerto Rico, the Philippines, and Guam to the U.S. The U.S. would give Spain $20 million and an identity crisis. Cuba would become independent. Despite opposition from prominent Americans like Mark Twain and Andrew Carnegie, the latter of whom offered to personally buy the Philippines from the U.S. to grant it independence. The Senate ratified the treaty in early 1899, and the pro-empire side won America's great moral debate. "Hey, Mr. President, how about you do the right thing and give us our freedom?" Sorry, I would. But my advisors have just informed me that it's still the 1800s, and that means America's moral compass hasn't evolved enough yet. Come back in the 1900s and we'll see if things are different. Needless to say, America's Filipino allies felt a little betrayed. Just a few months earlier, McKinley had said that he couldn't find the Philippines on a map and didn't care, but now he was supposed to be running the place? That did not make sense. Violence between Filipino rebels and the American occupiers broke out before the treaty was even ratified, and since Filipinos had done most of the fighting against the Spanish, the Americans didn't really control a whole lot outside Manila. American troops now picked up the role of crushing a colonial rebellion right where Spain had left off. Even in Cuba, locals soon discovered that the independence they got wasn't quite the independence they had envisioned. The US military occupied the island for several years after the war, and only left once Cubans wrote a clause into their constitution declaring that America could interfere in their affairs whenever it wanted. The US retained tight controls over Cuba's economy and government, and even came back to occupy the islands again shortly after leaving the first time. To many Cubans, this felt less like they were independent, and more like they were an American puppet. This animosity contributed to the rise of Fidel Castro's communist regime in Cuba a few decades later. U.S. diplomat John Hay called the conflict with Spain a splendid little war because only a few thousand Americans died, and the fighting only lasted a few months. But that statement is misleading. There was nothing splendid about it for the thousands of parents on both sides whose children never came home. And there was nothing little for the future generations of Puerto Ricans, Guamanians, and Filipinos who would grow up subject to American colonial rule. Even though the Philippines has since gained its independence, Guam and Puerto Rico are still part of the U.S., and their people are still fighting for equality to this day. Hey, Mr. President, I was looking at this map right here, and I noticed there are some other islands that aren't part of the U.S. yet. Whoa. Wait just a minute there. Are you telling me that this era of American imperialist expansion is going to have a... Ugh! There's nothing interesting happening in the world. What am I supposed to do while I wait for part 2 to come out? Oh, I know. I should call my member of Congress and ask them to support equal rights for the people living in American territories. Hi, member of Congress. Will you support that? Boop, boop, boop. He hung up on me. Well, I guess that just means you'll have to call too. And if everybody calls, then they'll have to do something about the problem.